Hey everyone, today we'll be taking a look at how to build a fully accessible slide over component in React, and we'll be using Tailwind UI, Tailwind CSS, React-Aria, and Framer Motion. We'll be using an existing Tailwind UI component as the base for our component today, and we will extend it with the React-Aria library to ensure that it's fully accessible. And then we'll also add Framer Motion just to provide some nice basic animations that will make the component really feel complete. By the end of this video, you should have a fully working implementation of the Tailwind UI component that you'll be able to use in your React application. So without further ado, let's jump right in. So if you haven't heard of Tailwind CSS, it's a utility for CSS framework that essentially removes the need for you to write your own custom CSS. Instead, what you do is you use these utility classes provided by Tailwind to build and style your UI. We're also going to be using another product built by the Tailwind team, and it's called Tailwind UI. So what Tailwind UI is it's a collection of components that are built using just plain HTML and Tailwind CSS, and you can use them within your application or website. Now, these components are fully customizable because what you get out of the box is literally just the HTML and the required Tailwind CSS classes, and then the rest is up to you. So you can change them up in whichever way you see fit, you can expand their functionality, and so on. This also means that if you want to use these components in your app that's built using a library like React or Vue, then you'll need to implement some of this interactivity yourself. Now, I want to mention that Tailwind UI is a paid product, so you need to buy a license to have access to the entire collection, but the Tailwind team was gracious enough to provide some of them for free. The sample that we'll be using is called Slide Over, and it's located in the Overlays category. So if you click on here, you'll see that the first example is available for free. And what we get, as I mentioned, is if you click on the code tab, we get our HTML, we get our classes from Tailwind CSS that we need to build this. Right, and it mentions that it needs Tailwind CSS 2.0. And then here you have the notes. This mentions that this is background overlay and show hide based on the slide over state. So we will need to implement the show hide functionality of the slider ourselves. But we do have the basic specs here. So for example, over here, we're provided with the animations that will be required, and we're actually going to be using this information once we get to the Framer Motion part of the video. So we won't worry about it for now, but we do have that information. So I've already got an app set up using Create React App and Tailwind CSS already installed. And as you can see right now, it doesn't do anything. It's just a simple starting point for us. So on the page, you'll see that I've got some Tailwind classes to define my layout. I've got my button. So the idea is we want to implement our slide over that when I click this button, it will open up. All right, so first let's go back to Tailwind UI and copy over the code that's included. So just like I did with the button here, I want to make this into a separate component. So in my app here, you'll notice that I have a folder called components. So in this folder, I'm going to create another file called slide over. And right now, it's just going to be a simple React component. So I'm going to paste the code from Tailwind UI over here. And let's clean this up a little bit, right? So I don't need that. We don't need this right now. So as I mentioned, we'll be using these options for the animations when we get to the Framer Motion part of our example. So right now, we don't need this. I'm just gonna remove all of this stuff. All right, also the comments. Okay. And here is where our component will go. or sorry, our content of our slide over. Right, so I'm just gonna say placeholder for now. All right, so I've got the basic skeleton of our slide over rendering here. So as you see, this is all stuff that we got from Tailwind UI. Now, the first thing we need to do is we need to update this attribute from class to class name. Right, this way our Tailwind actually works. So let's save that. And now in my app, I just want to include it on the main page. So I need to import slide over from components / slide over. And then I'm just going to put it below the button here. So our slide over. Right, so we got the slide over rendering, which is cool, but as you see, it's not interactive, so it's rendering on top of everything else. So let's go ahead and fix that. Now, a few things here. You'll see how we have the panel title and the placeholder as well. Now, right away, I'm gonna know that this is something that I'll want to pass to my component. So let's go ahead and just include it here. So we're gonna need a title, and then I'm thinking we'll just do our placeholder as children, so I can just reuse the whatever's passed to this component. So title, and then I'm gonna put children here. Right. Okay, and now where we use our slide over, I'm gonna say title. Let's say this will be an item details panel. When you click on it, I want to see more information about some item. And let's say in here, I'm gonna have an input, some text input, and let's say I'll just have another button in here that says okay. And I don't like the way that looks. Let's make that look a little bit better. I'm gonna have another div. I'm gonna make that flex. Make it flex call. Right, so that there. What else? Let's style this input a little bit more as well. I'm gonna have border gray, I don't know, 500, let's say, and I'm gonna make the edges rounded like our button already. There, that's better. And then I want my button to give a little bit of a space between the input there, so I'm going to add some top margin. All right, so we've got our slide over, but it still doesn't it's not interactive. So let's do that next. So one of the things we're gonna do in here is we'll add a prop called isOpen to tell us whether the slide over panel should be open or not. And then for now, we'll just simply show or hide it. So if it's open, then we want to render. Right, and then What did I do here? Unterminated. Oh yeah, right. All right. So now, as you see, we don't see the slide over panel anymore, and that's because currently is open prop is false because we're not passing it to the slide over component. So let's now implement that on our main page where we're consuming the slide over. So I'm just going to use React use state hook. Oops, there we go. And I'm just going to have is open and set is open, and by default it will be false. And then what we can do is when we click the button and add an on click, that will then set is open to true. And then we also want to have the same thing to happen when user closes the slide over panel. So maybe on, let's say when we click the OK button, we want that same thing to happen. So we'll say on click, we want that is open to be false. Right. Oh, and then we need to pass that to our slide over component. And you'll see in a little bit why I chose this name. This we'll be using this very shortly. So there's a reason why I chose this specific name. All right, so we've got that. So let's see, when we click on the button, the slide over appears, and then when we click OK, it goes away. Right. Now, one thing is when we click on the X, it doesn't close. So let's do the same thing as we do for the OK button, but for the close icon, and that will be in our slide over component. So actually, one of the why don't we instead of specifying it for each button, we know that handler will be the same for anywhere in our slide over component. So let's just pass a function to that. So we'll say unclose will be our callback, and then on our close button, which is this one, we can just say on click, we're going to call the unclose handler. Okay, let's save that and let's see if that works. Now if I click on the X, oh, right. So we added the prop, but we didn't actually pass anything. So let's do that here. Let's create a function called handle on close, and this will just say set it open to false. And let's be one of the cool kids and turn this into an arrow function. Okay, so now got our handle on close, so we can do, well, first of all, we can replace that here, right? So we can say on click, we want to handle on close, and then the same thing for our slide over component. We want to say on close, we want to handle on close. Okay, save that. Now, if we refresh, click on the X, the window closes. All right, now notice how when we click on the button and the panel comes up, I move this over, see how the outline is still on the button that we clicked at. The focus hasn't changed. So for someone who's either visually impaired or navigating with the keyboard, they won't know that this panel opened up, right? I'd have to manually go and move to the next element. And then I can also tab backwards using the keyboard, and you'll notice in the background I still tab back to the button. So this is a problem. Generally we want the modal or the slide over in our case. We want it to contain the focus, and we want the first element to be automatically focused as well, so that our user knows that, you know, the context of whatever it is that they're doing, it's now within this container here. So that's problem number one. Problem number two, and you can't see it right now, but I'm gonna add a bunch more text to the bottom just so I can scroll the page. So if I just go over here, we'll add a paragraph, and then add some text, and then let's say add some padding, and just say copy it a bunch of times. All right, so right now my page scrolls. So if I open this back up, notice how I can still scroll the page. So all the content behind the slide over, it's still scrollable, which is not good. We don't want that to happen. Much like with the focus, we want the context of what the user is doing to be within this panel. So that's another problem that we need to fix. And one last thing, if a user is navigating with the keyboard and they open this up, in addition to the focus changing, we also want the user to close our dialog with the escape key. So right now, if I press escape, nothing happens. And generally, if a user is navigating with the keyboard, the expected behavior is for the escape key to close the modal or the dialog, or in our case, the slide over panel. So those three things are the main 3 points that we want to get to work in order to be able to say that our component meets all the accessibility criteria. And actually one more point that I forgot to mention. So if I go over to Firefox, where we have Accessibility Inspector, and we open up the panel, notice how everything on our page, including the content behind our panel over here, is still visible to the screen reader. So when a screen reader parses through our page, generally when the content changes and the user's focus changes to this modal here, we don't want the screen reader to have all that extra content to worry about. We want it to only focus on the context of where we are here. So all this extra stuff, it's unnecessary, and it should not be in our tree here. So that's another thing that we'll need to take care of. So with all of that in mind, as you can see, this is quite a long list of things to take care of manually every time. Not just that, but you also have to think of the proper accessibility patterns for each specific scenario, and make sure that it's all semantically correct. It's quite a lot. Luckily for us, there's a library that helps us out with that. And this library is called React-Aria. React-Aria is one of the React Spectrum set of libraries, and it has everything to do with accessibility. So this helps us out when we're building out our components. It helps us handle all the accessibility related things. So we'll see for our use case today, it'll have everything to do with overlays. So we'll be utilizing a number of these hooks to handle all those concerns that we had. Right, so for example, use prevent scroll. We will use this to handle our scrolling problem that we saw. So to install, pretty standard.
right? And I already have that installed in the project, so we can just go ahead and start using some of them. All right, so the first one that we saw is the use prevent scroll. So let's go ahead and add this to our project. So in our app.js, go ahead and import use prevent scroll from React-Aria. And then in our component here, we can simply call that. Now remember that it expects one option, right? And that is disabled. So we want to pass is disabled, and we want it to be disabled whenever the slide panel is open, and we want it to be enabled whenever slide panel is closed. So we can take is open, right, and say when it's not opened, it's disabled. So that way, when slide panel is closed, our page will be able to scroll, and when the side panel is open, it will not, the page will not scroll. So let's save that and reload the page. So now when we expand it, now I'm trying to scroll right now and it's not moving. Right, so that part is handled. Now when we close it, we see that our scrolling is restored. Next, let's handle our focus containment problem. So for that, React-Aria has this component called focus scope. So focus scope manages focus for all of its descendants. So this sounds exactly like what we need. So let's go ahead and import that. And in our component here, we want to say that whenever the slide over is open, whatever it contains, we want the focus to be contained there. So in our case, this looks like a good place to put that. So whenever it's open, we'll say we want to put focus scope, and let's just wrap that. And now we need to import it. So import, focus scope from React-Aria. Right, and there's a few options there that, not options, there's a few props that we can set here. So one of them is called contain. Basically, this specifies whether we want the focus to be locked to whatever is within here. Okay. Next one we want is restore focus. And this one is whenever we have the slide over open and we close it back, we want the focus to be back to what originated that action. So in our case, that's this button here. So we want the focus to be restored back to that button whenever we close our panel. So let's go ahead and add that as true as well. And the last one is autofocus. So this will automatically focus on the first focusable element within the tree. And we want that as well because we want, whenever our panel opens up, we want the first focusable element within there to be focused. So let's let's do that as well. Okay, now let's see if that worked. So I'm going to tab to it, press enter, and look, now the first focusable element, which is the close button, is automatically focused on. Not only that, but now when I tab through it, the focus stays within this panel. Very cool. It still doesn't automatically dismiss when I press the escape key, and it still doesn't close when I press on the that background. So we'll still need to handle that, but our focus problem is solved. So that's great. And all we had to do for that is use one extra component. Next, we're going to take a look at using a number of these hooks together. So we're going to be using the use dialog hook, which in turn relies on also the use modal and the use overlay to work together in conjunction. And what this will do is we'll essentially handle all of the remaining accessibility concerns for us. So things like hiding the content behind our panel from the screen readers, making sure that when we press the escape key or click on the outside of the panel, it closes, and all of those things. So we're going to take a look at how we can utilize those. Now I'm going to be relying on the use dialog example here in their documentation quite a bit, but there's a few things I'll do slightly differently. So if you'd like, check out this example as well for more details. But so the first thing we need to do is we need to wrap our entire application in one of these overlay providers. So an overlay provider basically contains everything that has to do with the overlays that utilize React-Aria, right? So how do they behave when there's more than one of them on the page, and things like that. So let's do that first. Right, so we want to import our overlay provider in our app.js, and I'm going to wrap my entire application in this provider. So let's say at the top level here, let's say overlay provider. Okay. The next thing we need to do is we need to include an overlay container. So an overlay container will basically contain what is the overlay that we want to designate as one unit. So in our example, this will be the slide over component. So I'm going to import the overlay container from React-Aria, and then basically I want this to be the top level component in my slide over component. So it makes sense to put it as the top level element. So now instead of the fragment, we have the overlay container, right? So now before we proceed, there's actually one thing I need to do before we can start utilizing the hooks. I want to do one thing. Basically, when I was working through this, I noticed for some reason the hooks were not working properly when my component didn't unmount completely. So we need to ensure that wherever these hooks are used, our component will fully unmount. And in order to have that, I'm going to create another component and call it slide over content. And it will take in props as one object because we're actually going to be utilizing props in our hooks, so it just makes sense to use it as one. Now, with that said, we will need, well, first of all, we'll need to copy all of this. And let's put it here. All right, what is going on here? Ah, right. I want slide over content. Right, and I guess our content in this case will be children that are passed to this component, right? So we need to pass children down to the slide over content, which means that we're also need to extract a couple of these props. So we'll need on close, we'll need children and title. Some props. Okay. And then we'll need to pass those along to our slide over content. So title, on close is on close, like so. Okay. Oh, and one more thing. I actually want to move the focus scope down a few because when we open this up, I only want the focus to be within this panel. I don't want it to be on the backdrop. So I'm going to move this down a little bit, down to the section over here. Okay, like so. All right. Next, we'll need to use a bunch of these hooks together. So we're going to use the use overlay, use modal, and use dialog. And what we're going to do is we're going to pass some of the props to them. So these props will be like title and the on close callback and so on. And we're also passing it to it a ref to the basically our container. All right, so we'll need to do these things here. So let's just we can actually just copy from their example here, and then now remember, this will need to be in our slide over content component because we want these hooks to run every time the component mounts. Okay, let's change that to const. Let's redo that. Okay, so we can just copy from here and paste it in our code here. Now I'm just going to change the let to a const and use overlay. So this will be from React-Aria, right? So we need to add it here, and then we're also going to use modal and use dialog. Okay, so we've created our ref. We've called the use overlay hook. We passed with our props, which will contain our title, the on-close callback, and so on. And when we get back is overlay props that we can utilize in our components. So we'll need to do the same for modal props, I believe. Let's check. Yeah, modal props, and then dialog props and title props. Okay, so use modal, and then the same thing. We're still passing it to the same ref because it's just one container that we're caring about. So dialog props and title props, and this will be from use dialog props and ref. Okay, so now that we've got these props, let's actually apply them. So where do we do that? Well, our overall container will be this section here. So we can just apply it over here. So we can say ... overlay props, and then we can say dialog props and modal props. Right, and now the only thing left is our title. So our title is the h2 over here, so we can simply let's say we can just add it over here, title props. Ooh, and I almost forgot, we also need to apply a ref, right? So a ref that needs to be over here where we had all the other props. So we're gonna say ref equal to ref. Okay, so that takes care of our slide over content subcomponent. So now if we go back to our main component over here, there's a couple more props that we need to pass. So one of the props is dismissible, I believe. Yes, so if we look at the use overlay hook, and if we look at one of the props that we can pass to it, you'll see that one of them is dismissible. So whether they close the overlay when the user interacts outside of it. So this is exactly what we want. So let's copy that. Let's go over here. We'll say is dismissible. And the last thing, we want to indicate whether it's open or not. So remember I said there was a reason why I used the specific names for the props. This is why, because these props need to be passed to the hooks in React-Aria. And this is also the reason why I left props as a single argument here, because I just didn't want to have to repeat them throughout here. Okay, now before I save this, let's take a look at our current functionality in the Firefox accessibility tools. So if we take a look at the tools here, you'll notice that when we click on this, notice how dialog is correctly identified, right? However, there's still this section behind that is visible to the screen reader. So let's see what that looks like. If I save, and now navigate to it with the keyboard, and I press enter. So we see the first element is still focused. That's great. I can tab through. I still have my focus containment, which is awesome. But now if I press escape, the slide over goes away. And if I click outside, it also closes. Right, so our dismiss functionality is working as expected. Not only that, but if we head over to the Firefox Accessibility Inspector, look at what happens. If I drill down to where the main content is, which is labeled by this section here, look what happens when I open our slide over. That section goes away, right? So to our screen reader, it's not visible. So it's one less tree it needs to parse. Not just that, but check out how it's labeled. So it's labeled as a dialog, so it's a very clear functionality and behavior indication to the screen readers. And also it's labeled with the title that we passed to our component. Okay, so with that, we've handled the accessibility part of this component. So it's keyboard interactable, focus is contained, escape key works, pressing on the outside works. Everything looks awesome from that perspective. Now, one last thing, and it's not really a requirement. Technically, everything works, but we want our slide over to look nice, and we want it to be smooth. So let's add some animations. Now, if you remember in this Tailwind UI code snippet, we had these comments that provided a number of animation properties that we can use. So let's utilize these. And for that, we're going to use the library called Framer Motion. Now, Framer Motion is a pretty powerful set of tools. It's a library to handle all things that have to do with animation. And we're going to utilize it. So we're going to use a component called Animate Presence. And what this does is it basically handles all the animations for you for the components that get removed from the React tree. So whenever a component mounts and unmounts, Framer Motion will handle everything that has to do with animating the components in and out of the DOM with the most reasonable defaults, so to speak. So you don't have to worry about the intricacies of animating these elements. Framer Motion will handle that for you as long as you specify, all the necessary options. Now, I love this declarative nature of it, where you can just say what you want done and you don't really care about how it's done exactly, but you still have the options of getting a little bit more detailed, like we'll see in our example. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is we need to import the Animate Presence component as well as the motion set of components that we'll be using. So the first thing in our slide over, we're going to import from Framer Motion. And the first thing we'll do is we'll go to where our main slide over component is. And just below the overlay container, we'll add that where we have our slide over content. Right, so over here, let's add that. And the next thing we need to do is, like we'll see in the example here, so Motion provides you a set of its own wrappers around the common HTML elements. So we have motion.div, for example, so we can utilize that in our component. And then as you see, you can provide a number of animation options to it, and we'll go over those in a second. So the first thing we need to do is in our slide over content over here. So actually, before we do that, if we go back to the Tailwind UI and look at the code sample, if we go back to these comments about the animations, we can see what the options that are needed. So the first one is for the background overlay. So this will be the background when we open up our slide over. So this portion here, right? So we want that background to animate nicely. And as you see here, we've got the entering animation of, so it goes from opacity of 0 to opacity of 100. And then on the leaving animation, which basically when it closes, we want the opacity to go from 100 down to 0. And then the animations themselves are ease in out and with the duration of 500. So even though in Framer Motion we're not using these exact values, or rather this exact syntax, we know the values that we need to get. So if we go back to our code and within our slide over content, the topmost div, or sorry, not the topmost, but the second from the top, this one here, right? We want to change that to emotion.div. So we still want to apply these same class names. But now what we can do is we can add the options for the Framer Motion. So we want to say initial, which is what is the initial state that it will be in. And as we saw in the Tailwind UI options, we want the opacity to go from 0 to 100. Okay, so we can say opacity 0, and now the animation that will be done when our component is mounted, we can specify that via the animate prop, and that will say opacity. And as we saw in the example on the Framer Motion website, it's instead of 100%, it's 1. Okay, and then the last one we want is exit, and we also want that to be 0. So let's just add that here. Okay, so that handles the background piece. Now let's check out whether that works or not. So let's save that. And you already caught a glimpse of that there. So let's do it again. So now if we click on this, notice that background faded in, right? And the same thing with the fade out. So that works, but this piece rendered quicker. So let's handle that part as well. Now we saw in the Tailwind UI code, we had the second comment here, which is the slide over panel. And we see that this is regarding the section. So we'll know that we need to apply this to the section element. But let's see here. The options are on entering. We're going from translate X to full. So basically this takes up the full width to translate X0. So basically this will make it animate from kind of the outside of the page and animate it in from the side, right? So that will achieve that nice little animation of it sliding in. So let's go ahead and add that. Okay, now we use motion.div, so we can do the same thing for our section, which is this here. And I can go and say update tag, and I want that to be, instead of section, I want it to be a motion section. Okay. Now, just like before, we can say initial, and that will be X. X. And we want that to be from 100 to 0. So let's go ahead and do that. So we can say 100%. And animate will be x of 0. And now the exit animation, let's check. We want to go from 0 to 100. So we'll say exit is 100% as well. Okay, now one last thing we can do is we can specify the exact animation and its duration as well. So we know that we want the ease type to be is in out. So we will specify that in our motion component here. So we can say transition is equal to, and here we can say ease, and the type is ease in out. And we'll also need duration, which is 500 milliseconds. So in Framer Motion, it needs to be in seconds, so we'll say 0.5. And if we save that and go back, look at that nice animation. So the background faded in, and then the main content slid in from the side. Okay, so as a recap, what we implemented today is a slide over panel that when activated, notice you'll have the nice animations here. So the background faded in with the main content sliding over from the side. We'll have the first element within our panel focused right away, which is the close button. And if we tab through our elements, notice how the focus is contained to only the panel. So in addition, the background content is not scrollable. So scrolling is disabled for anything outside of our panel. And also, if we look at the accessibility inspector here, it is semantically identified as a dialog, which for the screen readers is the correct identification for something like this. And you'll notice the title here as expected. Okay, and then the one last thing is the our dialog or slide over panel is dismissible either with the escape key or by clicking on the outside of the panel here. And then the focus is restored to the element that originally invoked it. If you're interested in looking at the code of the final result of what we did today, the link for the GitHub repo will be available in the description below.
All right, so this will be it for today's video. Hopefully you found it useful and learned some new things. And hopefully this gives you an idea of how to go about implementing a Tailwind UI component in React. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you all in the next video.